Toby Perkins.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Hendrick. Great pleasure to follow my neighbour on that. It is a great shame that this debate coincides with the Prime Minister's statement today, because I know there's a number of people that would also have liked to have been here under different circumstances, but that's the vagaries of the political calendar, as we all know here. I'd like to start by paying tribute to Richard and Alison and the whole family, because they faced a grief and an anguish that every parent it's their worst nightmare. And we know that there is nothing worse, almost nothing worse, than burying and attending the funeral of our own children. But to attend the funeral of your children under circumstances like this, and to think alongside that, that steps might have been taken that might have prevented that, is an unspeakable anguish that no parent should have to tolerate. And so to respond to that appalling chasm of grief by saying we want to get something positive out of this, that we know we can't bring Gracie back, but we want to support other families to not suffer the kind of grief that we have done, I think is inspirational, and it makes me very proud to have them as constituents and as friends. I'd also like to pay tribute to Jackie Barnett-Wheatcroft for bringing together this petition. And Jackie leapt into action when as soon as the funeral had passed, and initially introduced a paper petition which was taken on board by the entire community. Over 17,000 signatures went on that in just a matter of weeks, and Jackie actually counted them all, which was quite a performance. And I will be presenting a paper petition later this evening, which will also refer to that. But then, having been told that in order to get this debate we needed an e-petition, she then went ahead and worked with the parliamentary authorities, assisted by the Honourable Gentleman from North East Derbyshire, to get a petition on the parliamentary system, which has led to this debate today. The funeral of Gracie Spinks was attended by thousands, and the murder of Gracie has sent shockwaves throughout the people of Chesterfield and far beyond, as the Honourable Gentleman from Bolsover referred to a minute ago. And I know there are many people in Chesterfield who would have liked to have been here if COVID restrictions hadn't have prevented that. But the outpouring of grief and anger that met Gracie's murder didn't just surface because of the tragedy of a vibrant life cut needlessly short, but also because of the sense that more could have been done to save her, and that the support that a victim of stalking receives is so often inadequate. And that's what brings us to this debate today. Gracie's family and the wider Gracie's Law campaigners are determined that some good must come from this appalling tragedy, and that we should all do all we can to prevent other families suffering the same heartbreak that Gracie's family endured daily. And this petition is an important part of that campaign. Now, when the petition achieved 10,000 signatures, the government responded to it and pointed to the contribution that they'd made to the stalking advocacy charity Paladin. They also referred to other stalking advocacy charities like the Susie Lamplugh Trust, and they referred to the Tackling Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. And I suspect that will be some of what we hear from the Minister today. But just like the Honourable Gentleman from Bolsover, I'll also be hoping that in recognising the steps that government have taken, there will also be a recognition that what the experience of Gracie's family and so many others tells us is that far more needs to be done. And I entirely agree with what the Honourable Gentleman from Bolsover said about cultural change, about the difficulties that some men experience in terms of recognising their role in an ever-changing world. But I do think that there needs to be a real focus within this debate on policing, on justice, on access to the courts, and on enforcement of the existing laws that are there, as well as, of course, trying preventative measures to prevent people acting in the way that stalkers have done. Now, in advance of this debate, I spoke to Paladin to understand more about the barriers that victims face and to hear more about what Paladin see as the steps that would make a difference. Now, they explained that stalking is often misunderstood, both by the wider public and indeed by police forces. It can be misrepresented as domestic violence, but in Gracie's case, and indeed in many cases, there's never been a relationship between the stalker and the victim. Some victims have never even met their stalkers, and the nature of the offence is often misunderstood and incorrectly recorded. The nature of stalking can often progress and change shape and increase in its intensity and its obsession. And it will often also be a series of acts, some of which are in themselves criminal offences, and others of which are not. Offences like vandalising a victim's car or making malicious communications then end up being recorded as a series of individual, different criminal damage offences, rather than being recognised as a collective campaign of stalking. And in common with many other crimes that take place predominantly against women, stalking charities tell me that there is often a huge burden of proof placed by the police on victims before the police start investigating, in a way that isn't expected in other crimes. When someone phones the police to complain that they've been the victim of a house burglary or they've had their phone nicked, it's accepted as fact that the claim that they are making, the crime that they are reporting, has been committed. Whereas with crimes of this sort, there is an expectation that victims will turn up armed with evidence in order to get an investigation going. And that frustration at the lack of investigation and detection that takes place is a common complaint of stalking victims and their families. Alongside the physical manifestations of stalking, the majority of incidents of stalking will often have an online aspect, which could be threats made online, could be posting things that are designed to be embarrassing or intimidatory. It could be posting abusive messages and posting about doing harm to a victim. Now, these aspects will often leave a footprint, and if police followed up and investigated the online presence of accused stalkers, they'd identify the evidence that they need. But because these events have often been recorded as criminal damage or malicious communications or other lesser offences, the wider investigation simply doesn't happen. And a lot of the evidence that I've heard and seen in this case is that if only a number of different events had been pieced together in a single picture, there might have been greater support for Gracie. So this petition asks for government to increase funding to ensure there are people advocating for victims of stalking in every police force. And I think that this aspect of the petition is an incredibly important one that I really want to stress to the Minister, because the response that the Minister gave was about, in response to the petition when it reached 10,000, was predominantly about supporting stalking advocacy charities. Now, charities like Paladin do amazing work going into police forces and training up officers, providing a kit that officers can utilise. But what we need is that culture within the police force, and not a junior person doing that, but someone with the authority within that police force to ensure that that culture changes and that every single police officer operates in the ways that we would want our own daughters to be protected if it was us who were reporting this to the police. Now, the postcode lottery or inconsistency of service, both from force to force and even within forces, depending on which officer picks up the case, is entirely unacceptable. And the need for all forces to have in place a specific senior case manager with an appropriately senior ranking to ensure that stalking is properly understood and appropriately policed is urgent. So I want to stress this point, that when we talk about stalking advocacy, yes, we're talking about supporting those charities, but we're also talking about an advocate inside that police force who is going to make sure that the voice of victims are heard. But I think there are other aspects that we can deal with here in this place. My honourable friend from the Gower referred to sentencing and the appallingly lenient sentences that were handed out in the case that she referred to and that we've all seen. It really is imperative that government recognise, and I'll speak in a moment a bit more about the impact of stalking on victims, but it is important that, that the government recognise the physical and mental torture that stalking operates on its victims, and that the sentences are appropriately severe. It is also crucial that this backlog in courts is tackled, because you cannot underestimate the number of people who go to the police and then find 12, 18, 24 months later that offences that have been reported have still not got to court. And often victims will be in a position of saying, I simply can't cope with waiting for this any longer, I want it over. And they will, as a result, not go through with the process, and the perpetrators will get away with it. And often they will hear about the appalling situation in our courts and decide not to pursue the case with the police. In Gracie's case, it was very much a case of her just wanting it to stop. She wasn't looking to necessarily pursue the legal aspects at that moment. It was about wanting the appropriate support. And so there are a whole variety of victims out there that are being failed by our police, that are being failed by our sentencing regime, and are being failed by the fact they're unable to get into court to have their cases heard. And each of these are really central to this question, as well as all the important points that are raised within that strategy around the culture, around tackling perpetrators, around trying to discourage and other aspects. We need to make sure we get the policing, the sentencing and the court availability right. Now, as I said a moment ago, Mr Hendrick, there is a key role for stalking awareness charities like Paladin, and they do great work improving the knowledge base of police forces. But the charitable sector is only a part of this solution, and the petition, and I reiterate, demands that government recognise that the failure of the Spinks family experience and takes action to ensure a culture of understanding and zero tolerance is endemic in every police force. A specific stalking advocate within the police force would be expected to have regular oversight of stalking cases and ensure that officers developed the understanding and the skills that is too often lacking. Gracie Spinks' case had the most appalling ending imaginable, the nightmare of every parent. Thankfully, of course, most cases don't end in violent murder, but the impact on all victims of stalking is profound. Stalking victims aren't free. They're constantly looking over their shoulders and forced, more than the rest of us, to be careful. They go out to their cars in the morning, wondering whether it will have been attacked. They open their post, wondering whether they'll be greeted by an abusive message. They turn on their computers, wondering what will have been posted to them or about them. Every time they answer their phones, they don't wonder if it will be a PPI salesman, but if the anonymous number will be spouting a torrent of hateful or disturbing abuse. They develop the habit of looking out for a certain car. Every red Ford Fiesta gives a victim a chill of fear if that's the car they know their perpetrator drives, until they can assure themselves that it isn't that car. Not all victims of stalking end in a graveyard, but they are all scarred. And it is so important that we give them the support that they need. There are male victims and female perpetrators of stalking, but it is predominantly a crime by men against women. It is about power and control, and whilst it can take many forms, its effects are always debilitating. So, Mr Hendrick, this petition is one of tremendous importance, as is the Minister's response. I was asked in a TV interview today how important this debate was, and I had to say I don't know. It's all really about the actions that the government take from it. We all know that we're in the process of discussing a huge number of issues in this place, and I think there is a widespread across the political spectrum desire to take action and prevent stalking. I'm absolutely certain that the Minister takes this as seriously as I do, but it's a case of whether the resources and whether the legal backing and whether the sentencing support and whether the determination to address the court shortage and whether all of those steps that need to be taken for us to be able to look the family in the eye and say we've genuinely done all that we can, whether those are the steps that are taken. So the petitioners demand that the government recognise that the steps that have been taken so far are not adequate and that standards of policing must improve for stalking victims. We are in the later stages in this place of the Police and Crime Bill, and we're told that the government are also intending to bring forward a Victims Bill. Both of these would seem appropriate vehicles to bring forward a Gracie's Law to ensure that not only is funding provided for a stalking advocate in every police force, but also that it leads to better protection for victims of stalking and that those obligations on police forces are written into law. We can never say, Mr Hendrick, that Gracie Spinks will be the last victim of a stalker. Tragically, that's almost certainly not the case. But we can resolve that we in this place will do all we can to ensure that police forces understand the crime and have the resources to tackle it, so that more families like Gracie's aren't left asking, why wasn't something done?